You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Can laugh, or can watch Matt laugh. So we're in a series walking through the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was an Old Testament prophet, and he's essentially putting this book together to teach us that the Lord, that this specific God of Israel and is the God of the world, is the only God there is, and that God is the central reality in every aspect of life. That's what he's trying to get across. And we're in the very middle of the book. We've been kind of taking jumps through it. We've landed right in the center. And it centers around someone called the servant. So you get this figure that shows up who has the same characteristics of the Lord that we've learned about earlier in Isaiah, and yet also is someone who's going to show up on the earth to bring about redemption for the nation of Israel, also for all the other people on the earth. Everyone from every tongue, tribe, and nation is going to have a chance to return to the Lord through this person. And the New Testament authors identify Jesus Christ as this servant. And so what we've seen in this section is that there are these 4 servant songs, these sort of specific passages that identify who the servant is and what he's come to do. And right now, as there's a bit of a break in chapter 51 of Isaiah. In chapter 51 is our passage for today. In the midst of learning about the servant, basically, the Lord teaches us something about ourselves. And in doing so, he prepares us to understand more of who the servant is, embrace him more with our lives, and see him as more of a factor in our lives going forward. And so we're going to read chapter 51, verses 9 through 16, kind of the heart of the chapter. It's on page 612 of your pew Bibles, the red books in front of you. It's also on the screen behind me. Here's what it says. It starts with the nation of Israel speaking. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. I am he who comforts you. Who are you that you are afraid of man who dies, of the Son of Man who's made like grass, and have forgotten the Lord your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, and you fear continually all the day because of the wrath of the oppressor when he sets himself to destroy? And where is the wrath of the oppressor? He who is bowed down shall speedily be released. He shall not die and go down to the pit, neither shall his bread be lacking. I am the Lord your God, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. And I have put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people. This is the word of the Lord. Now, again, this is the very heart of the chapter. The first part of the chapter that we didn't read goes over that the Lord is promising just a massive redemption, which happens a lot in this book, a massive redemption in a massive scale. And then the people respond with this: yes, wake up, O Lord. So there's a sense in which they're excited about what God's going to do, but their response indicates that they've been living under this sort of interesting narrative. They place it into this sort of weird narrative that God, up until now, has been asleep. And so they're glad he's talking about changing things, of course, but at some level they frame it as though their exile from the promised land that we've learned about in previous messages, as though this exile and the difficulties they face really happened because God fell asleep at the wheel of their destiny. And so they're really hoping he's going to wake up and fix everything that went wrong when he was asleep. And this is their pitch. They're very excited. God, wake up. Yes, it'd be great if you woke up. And then God responds and says, essentially, I have been awake. It's you who've been asleep. And he explains what that looks like in their lives. And that maps onto our lives too. So there are times that we live as though God has fallen asleep on us, as though he's distant and not present, and he's essentially just not a factor. And in those times, what the Lord wants you to see is that very gently, very lovingly, but very clearly, is that you've actually fallen asleep on him. And it's there, believe it or not, it's when you realize that he hadn't fallen asleep, you did, that you find a door open to you that leads you to the place your soul really wants to be, the sort of rest and internal coherence of your soul, which is to have a life in which you are close to, interacting with, regularly understanding the centrality of the God who made you, the God who loves you. And so that's what this passage is about. And that's what we're going to look at. So we're going to look at these three things. There's a false narrative, a true narrative, and a wake-up call. The false narrative is that God isn't awake to us. The true narrative is that we aren't awake to God. And then the wake-up call answers the question, how do we wake up to God? How do we become people who are awake to him? So first, the false narrative. The first half of the passage that we read, you notice words like Rahab, piercing the dragon, drying up seas. What this is these are all references to the Exodus, to the time when Israel, hundreds of years before, was enslaved in Egypt, and God rescued them through plagues and miracles and parting of the Red Sea. Rahab was sort of a metaphor for Egypt. It was this sort of large superpower, this world superpower from the days of old, that God pierced with these miracles and this kind of radical deliverance, and then led them to Zion, to the Promised Land, with great singing and so on. And so this is what they're recollecting. They're saying, yeah, I remember when you were this major factor in the life of our people. But where has that power and presence and care been now that a new superpower has sort of taken them over and they've been sent into exile and they're enslaved? And they're saying, well, what happened in the meantime is God fell asleep. But if he would wake up, he could do all this again. He could rescue us again if he would just wake up. And so that metaphor is really, really powerful and really poignant, because when you're asleep, when you're saying someone's asleep to you, you're saying basically that they're absent. Like if you're in a room with someone who's asleep, you're basically alone. Like you're not sitting around going like, oh yeah, this other person in the room with me. No, they're basically gone. Their eyes are closed, they're asleep. And that absence has all these different effects. Like in a sense, when you're asleep to someone, you're absent to them personally. Like I said a moment ago, you're alone. When someone's asleep, you're not with them, you're by yourself. And so in that sense, to say that God is asleep to you is to say that you're on your own. You're isolated. You're not with him in any substantive way. He's asleep to you. But it's not just that. There's also a kind of absence that's physical. Like when your body goes into a really deep sleep, it's actually multiple chemicals in your brain combine to paralyze your skeletal muscles, which is a crazy thought. Like the muscles that help you breathe and help your heart beat and apparently help your eyes move really rapidly, they're cool. But everything else is paralyzed, ostensibly because we think it's because you'll hurt yourself if they're not, like when you're dreaming or something. But you are completely powerless when you're asleep. Doesn't matter how strong you are, you're paralyzed. You can't use that strength. So if you're in trouble and someone who's with you is asleep, they're not going to help you. They're paralyzed. They can't use that physical strength. If you're at the gym and you load up too much weight on the bar, you can have the world's strongest man next to you, and it doesn't matter if he's asleep. Because if he's asleep, you're on your own. Like you got to figure this out by yourself. And so if God is asleep to you, there's a sense in which he might be very powerful. They believe, oh, he's a very powerful God. But it doesn't matter because he's asleep to us. That power is not being used for us. That power is disengaged. And then there's also the truth that when you're asleep, you're absent emotionally. On a kind of a deeper level, like sleep leaves you unable to care about someone else, at least while you're asleep. So it's not just your muscles that are disengaged, it's also your heart in that sense. So you're emotionally disengaged from the world around you in the way that it doesn't matter how compassionate a person is. If they're asleep, they're not really available to comfort you. It doesn't really matter how much someone loves you if they're asleep when you need them to care for you, because they're absent. They're not there for that. And so God being asleep means that no matter how compassionate he is, and boy, did they believe he was compassionate, steadfast love, loving kindness abounding. But it was disengaged. He was asleep to them. You're on your own. And so the people say, awake, awake, O Lord. Lord, we want your presence. We want your strength. We want your care for us. They remember a time when it felt like the Lord was really present, really powerful, really caring and alert and using that strength and care to rescue them. But recently, that's not how it's been, which is understandable. Exile creates this kind of deep homesickness, this sort of like despair, and it's screaming at you every day because every day you wake up and you're not home. Like you're not in the land the Lord gave you. It's very clear to you. They have that saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Like in the same way, that's what kind of you have going on here. In your life, the loudest thing always gets the most attention. It's very difficult to not have that happen. And during the Exodus, they're looking back, they're saying, right now the loudest thing is the exile, but during the Exodus, the Lord was the loudest thing. Plagues and miracles and pillars of fire in the desert, like that's loud. That's the thing that commands my attention. That's a central factor. But since then, I don't know, the exile seems a lot louder. And so it just seems like he might be doing things, he's still loving, he's still powerful, but at the end of the day, he's not doing it for us. He's asleep to us, and we would love for him to wake up. And the same thing is kind of true of us. Like, for you, like, what are the loudest things in your life right now? Like, what are the things that call for your attention and your time and your mental and your emotional energy? Like, there are things that sort of are loud in your life. And practically speaking, like, do you live as though God is awake to those things? Is there any sense in which you feel like God's awake to that? Do you feel like he's present in them? Like he's powerful in them? Like his love is manifest in them somehow? Or does your life say that God is basically asleep to you in the ways that matter to you the most? And it's not just, now that's interesting, because that paints it in sort of a crisis sense, the loudest things, the big crises going on. But it's actually it runs deeper than that. It seeps from the crises into everyday life. It seeps into a narrative that you live under for the whole of your life. It becomes this narrative, like they did, where we believe that we believe certain things about God. There are certain things that we put in our doctrinal statements. We believe this about God, and this about God, and this about God. But those things don't end up being real factors in our day-to-day life. They're just not practically important to us. And that can look a lot of different ways. Maybe you sort of think of it as though, well, God, showed his power and his care when Jesus was on earth, and after that, it's on us to work all that out. Or he's definitely strong, he definitely cares, but we just aren't supposed to see those things as active in our day-to-day life. It's supposed to be a belief system, not something that really touches down. Or maybe the most common for Christians, he definitely loves us and is strong, and he shows that love and strength sometimes, like occasionally, in really significant ways. Like when we really need it, he sometimes shows up. But for the rest of our normal life, he's not really a factor. What you're saying there is that God wakes up from time to time, but most of the time he's asleep. And if that's the mindset you function with, then you're going to see it, because you're going to feel all those things we mentioned a moment ago. You're going to feel isolated sometimes. You're going to feel unprotected. You're going to feel uncared for. But what's interesting is you can flip that around too. It works the other way too. If you find yourself feeling isolated or unprotected or uncared for, in those moments, you're believing that God is asleep. Maybe not asleep to everyone, but at least asleep to you. And so that's that false narrative. What's the false narrative? It's that God might be very powerful and very loving, but for all intents and purposes, he's asleep to the things going on in your daily life. And so you should worship him, definitely worship him, but then do your best on your own to figure it out until he wakes up, if he wakes up. And hopefully he does. That's the false narrative. Now, that's point one. Point two, the true narrative. Now, what's God's response to this? Now, look at verse 12. I am he who comforts you. Now, we talked about earlier in this book how the language of Hebrew loves doubling for intensity. So when they said earlier, awake, awake, it's not like, hey, get up. It's like, wake up, wake up. Like, it might be a very submissive version, but it's a very loud and intense version. Awake, awake. And here, what does God say? He's matching it. I am he who comforts you. What's he saying? He's saying, I am awake. I am he who comforts you. In other words, I've been awake. And then he says, who are you? Which, in other words, means, I know where I've been. Like, do you know where you've been? And he begins to point out all sorts of fallout from the way they've been living in the subsequent verses, like the end of verse 12, 13, 14. He talks about, there's fear shows up multiple times in here. Forgetfulness, the idea that they're being oppressed and running away, fearful, anxious, scrambling. He talks about the one who stirs up the sea so its waves roar. He's talking about himself. We'll cover that later on. But that concept is that for the Jewish people, the waves that was the symbol of chaos. Any chaotic thing in the world, any uncontrollable thing that was bigger than you and scary, those were the waves, those were the sea. And so you have God here referencing, later we'll say it's a comforting thing, but right now he's saying, you guys are being tossed around, you're afraid of everybody, You're anxious, you're scrambling. He says, it's not working for you. Do you know where you are? And in the very next verse, we didn't read it, but in verse 17, you know how it starts? Wake yourself, wake yourself. So he's turning it back on them. You see, what's he saying? He's saying the whole time we've been looking around and thinking God must have fallen asleep on us. And he comes back and says, no. You've fallen asleep on me. That's what's happened. You think, he says, that I'm the one that's out of touch with reality, that doesn't see what's really going on in your life or in the world, or that I'm disengaged. But you guys are the ones who are out of touch with reality. Like, you're the ones who have fallen asleep. You're the ones who are disengaged. And that means you can't see my comfort, and you can't see the hope that's in front of you. Of course you think I'm not around. You fell asleep on me. And when you're asleep, you don't know who else is in the room. And so, we say things like, Lord, I'm not seeing your presence. I'm not seeing your power. I'm not seeing your love in my daily life. And we assume the reason is because God fell asleep on us. And then God is saying here, look, there's an explanation you're not seeing. And that explanation is that maybe you fell asleep on me. Maybe that's why this is happening. And so what he does is he takes the same metaphor and puts it back on us. So he says, so you think that I am absent and disengaged relationally with you. Just, no. You're absent and disengaged from me. I'm here. I'm trying to comfort you. I'm the omnipresent Lord of the universe. Like, everywhere you go, there I am. You're the one disengaged from me. You're the ones who are asleep to seeing how I'm present to you. And it works for all of them. We think of God's power as disengaged from our daily lives. He says, no, it's actually you who've lost awareness of me, and you've started dreaming of lesser things. It talks in this passage about fearing these people and fearing this and fearing that. You've started to think that you're unprotected, so you're the ones that fell asleep and started dreaming about all these lesser powers, these lesser things on the earth. When we think of God as distant and uncaring about our lives, he says, no, it's actually us who've lost awareness of the way he is caring about us. You're using sort of the same breaths he gives you, the same heartbeats to tell him how absent he is. And so you have all these ways. The reason we're living this way, God says, isn't because God fell asleep to us, but because we fell asleep to him. And you can see, just note the word forgetfulness in there. Forgotten. You've forgotten the Lord. This is another way of talking about being asleep. Like, you've essentially lost sight of, you've forgotten his reality, his impact, his centrality, his existence and intersection with all the things going on in your life. And so we end up living disengaged from the Lord. We end up living asleep. And it looks like fear and despair and numbness and scrambling and apathy and running from thing to thing to try and get some purchase on some security and some joy and latching on to various things to feel in control of our lives, all this stuff. When that's happening, we look around and go, well, we're doing this because you fell asleep on us. And God says, no, you're doing it because you fell asleep on me. That's the true narrative. That's point 2. And point 3, the wake-up call. What do we do about this? Now, in the passage, this passage is not geared just around diagnosis. You can see it. He's not just saying, FYI, you fell asleep on me, talk later. No, he's saying, like, look, he wants to rouse you from your sleep. He wants to rouse them from their sleep. He wants to rouse us from our sleep. And he points us to 2 things, to rouse you, to wake you up, the wake-up call, to his power and to his love. And fascinatingly enough, the very 2 things that we think are absent because he fell asleep on us, he says, you got to wake up to my power and wake up to my love. You have to. And the first one is power. That's the end of verse 12 through about verse 15. It mainly focuses on this power of God. And what you see there is, remember in junior high when you had to write essays comparing and contrasting things? What you have here is God sort of writing you a compare-contrast essay on him and all the stuff you're constantly afraid of and anxious about, and all the things you think are really powerful in your life. And so you see at the end of verse 12, who are you that you're afraid of man who dies, the son of man who's like grass? That's just heaping up ways that people are not eternal. You have the man who dies, the son of man, which is sort of like this kind of elbow in the ribs of hey, FYI, they need to keep having kids because they keep dying. And then you have like grass, which in the Near East, grass is a very temporary thing because the sun is not kind to grass. So it sprouts up and it dies. And he says, you're running around being afraid of all this stuff that is so temporary. Contrast that with the Lord who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. He's like, I was there when I made it. I'm clearly still in control of it. I'm going to be around far after all these other people are gone. He says, and you fear continually all the day. And so you have this sense of power. And that's at the end. I'm the Lord God who stirs up the sea so its waves roar. When you see the chaos of life, understand, I'm the one who stirs up the waves. I'm the one in control of the waves. I'm the one in charge of all of this. So don't think that that's more powerful than me. He's pointing at the power. Now, it's interesting. What happens is Scott, at one point, Pastor Scott, he was teaching a class on kind of how human beings are made up and how we grow and how we can love one another. And he was talking about how one of the ways it impacts, one of the things that gets in the way of, or impedes, I should say, the way we can love one another and impedes our own kind of growth is when we think that our desires, our emotions are bigger and more in control than they really are. And he did this, it was just ad hoc thing, like this random illustration he just did in the moment, because there was a big whiteboard, because Scott loves him a whiteboard, and he just grabbed one of those dry erase markers, and he said, it's sort of like these are like your emotions or your desires, and they get all up in your face, and he puts the marker right in front of his eyes, and he says, they get right here, and they take up your whole field of vision. Like, you can't see anything. You can't see, and you don't realize how small they are, because they are right here. They're really loud. They're right in your face. And so if you leave them here long enough, you start to think this is actually the way the world is. That they actually are that big. The biggest thing you can see, the biggest thing in the world. He says, but if you just moved them back and took a step back, you'd see these are actually smaller than you thought, less powerful than you thought. There are bigger things out there that you ought to be considering and thinking about. And that's basically what the Lord is saying here. You've got these temporary people, these temporary things, these temporary situations. They're not eternal at all, but they got right up in your face in the exile and whatever was going on in your life and mine. And they're right here, and they take up our whole field of vision, and we start thinking that they really are this big. And God is saying, no, compare, contrast. Take a step back. Look at the Lord of heaven and earth behind them and realize that they're a dry erase marker. They're significant, some of them. They are potent, some of them. They're real, but they're not as big as him. He says, you have to wake up to my power. They've forgotten the Lord's power. He says, you have to wait. It's the wake-up call. Wake up to what's really going on. Wake up to my power. But then there's also, the last verse is about his love. Verse 16. Now, in this last verse, the audience changes. This is one of the, I say this with no sarcasm whatsoever. There are some linguistic geniuses in the South who they plugged a giant hole in the English language by creating the word y'all. Now, this is a significant contraction. I'm not kidding in the least. Almost every other language has a second person plural pronoun. We don't. We economized and optimized. We're just going to have the one you. And so they fixed some linguistic stuff. They don't get enough credit for that. But unfortunately, that means that a language like Hebrew that has those different things, we don't always see it in English. What happened is along the way, in verse 16, we switched to a specific kind of singular you. So the Lord is now not talking to like everybody, to all of Israel. He says, no, I put my words in your mouth. Specific individual. He's talking about the servant. In the middle of the servant song. There's no one else he could be talking about. He says, I have put my words in your mouth, covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people. Now what you have here is the Lord saying, by putting my words in the servant's mouth, by basically what I'm doing with the servant, I am telling Zion that they are my people. That's weird, because Zion, house of Israel, say what nation of Israel, say what you want. These are all synonyms for the Lord's people. Like, they exist because of the Lord's people. This has been throughout the Old Testament. It's basically interchangeable. Why do you need to tell people who, by definition, are the Lord's people that they're the Lord's people? Why send a servant to tell someone whose name is the Lord's people that, hey, you're the Lord's people, you're my people? Well, what you have, that's what they needed to hear to wake up. The servant's going to come with a message, with the power of the Lord, the power of God to bear, and through that servant, the Lord is going to say, you're my people. Not just for Israel, we've seen in this book, but also for people from the ends of the earth. Remember the servant song we preached last time? And so you find this, and look, it's Palm Sunday, right? Palm Sunday is the day that Jesus made sure he wasn't going to be late for his own execution. His actions, his words, in his whole life, but especially Palm Sunday, Holy Week, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, the death of Jesus Christ into Holy Saturday, a day of mourning with not a twinge of hope, and then Easter Sunday in a glorious and a beautiful resurrection. Do you know what all that is? That is the Lord through the servant saying, you're my people. And you need to hear that sometimes. It's what they needed to hear. It's what we need to hear. I had a hearing on Tuesday. I've had a lot of hearings in my life through the foster care system. So on Tuesday, I had another hearing for my fourth little girl. My fourth child, a third little girl. And so she's almost 3.5 years old, and she is not adopted yet. Her older sister was adopted about 1.5 years in, and they said they were going to fast track this daughter, which I feel like in any part of the world, anytime someone says I'm going to fast track it, you should just kind of be wary. But so 3.5 years later, here we are. And basically, now foster care is an interesting journey because there are wounds in lots of places, and sometimes the right answer is for a child in foster care to go back to their birth family. Sometimes that's not the right answer. It's very difficult to figure out what that is, and there's lots of pieces that move. But this case, everyone, including the birth family, felt like the right thing was for her to be adopted by us. And so, but we had to wait for like 3 extra years for T's being crossed and I's being dotted and so on and so forth. And so I go to these hearings all the time. So I show up, and it's not like a cool like Matlock courtroom where everything's all wood and mahogany. It's basically like half like an office building with like 3 pews in the back, like these pews basically, just in the back of the room. So you come in and you sit down and you watch them just do like office work with this like legal jargon, and you don't know what it means, and then about 60 seconds later you leave. So that's like, and you show up at 8:30 and you hope they call you in before 5. And so I've been doing this for a while now, waiting for this to happen, for her to be open to adopt, because when she's open to adopt, it's basically just a matter of a couple of months. So I go and I go and I go, well, this last Tuesday, in the midst of all the legal jargon, it happened. Like, I don't know why this one as opposed to all the other 2.5 years, but it happened. And so it was fascinating because you got the bailiff, all these people who are kind of around and milling around in the back, and they're all looking at me because I'm tearing up at legal jargon. Like, I mean, they think it's sweet and stuff, but it's like, part of the first part, then move this and off the record, on the record, and I'm like, because I see it coming. I see it coming. I see the notice is proper. I see it coming. I see them say, let's move to Tuesday. I see them say it. And what I'm thinking the whole time, I do this every time. I have to stop this because you're going to think I'm too emotional to listen to. Because I know what that means is that I'm going to get to go home and I'm going to be able to, she's 3. Like, she gets it. She prays sometimes. Father, please help me get adopted. Like, she gets it. Her sister's adopted. She's not. She understands. Now, she's my kid. She's every much as much my kid right now. I love her as much as I love any other kids, of course. But I get to go home after that and say to her, like, adoption means finality. I get to say, like, I'm going to be the one that will never fall asleep on you. Like, I get to be the one who will be around, who will use my strength for you, who will emote for you. Like, I get to, my wife too, right? Of course, but I'm a little self-centered right now. So we get to do this, and we get to do it, and it's different because now I will be able to say, you are mine with no reservations, no qualifications, no maybes, no hopefullys. And that's a different thing. Like, do you understand? In Jesus Christ, the Lord of the universe is looking at you and saying, you are mine with no qualifications, no reservations, no maybes, no hopefullys. Finished and done. That's the kind of thing that wakes you up. That's what he's saying. You have to wake up to his love. You have to wake up to his power, wake up to his love. I'm going to send a servant. And through him, I'm going to say to you, you're mine. And how does he do it? It's like he remembers Isaiah. The Bible is a fascinating book. On Thursday night, late Thursday night into Friday morning, you have Jesus going to pray before he's executed. He hasn't been sort of taken into custody yet, and he brings his like closest of the close with him, and he says, and he falls down on his knees, and he's sweating blood, and he's praying, is there any way this cup could pass from me? Is there any other version of this that we could do where it wouldn't involve this kind of suffering for me to save these people? And what happens to his closest friends? What do? They fall asleep. They fell asleep on him. And so what do you see? And then what does Jesus get up and do? He gets up and he goes and he dies for them anyway. No qualifications, no reservations, no maybes, no hopefullys. This is the gospel. This is the power and the love of the Lord seen in Jesus Christ for people like you and me who fall asleep on him all the time. That's the wake-up call. That's how you wake up to the fact that maybe he didn't fall asleep, maybe we did. Maybe we just didn't see it, And we should. But there's more. Okay, there's more. Now, because this theme of sleep is picked up from Isaiah, and it's stretched out, and it's developed over the rest of the Bible. And often it references this chapter in Isaiah. It happens in 2 ways. Okay, one way is that you have the idea of awake and asleep as kind of a metaphor or a symbol for salvation, for trusting in Christ, for being born again, all these words the Bible gives us to describe entering into a true relationship with Jesus. And so like in Ephesians 5:16, big context, don't have time to get into it, but it says, Paul writes this, he says, therefore it says, appealing to an amalgamation of Old Testament scriptures, including Isaiah 51, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. The idea is that you're asleep, in a sense, to God and all the reality of that, and then salvation wakes you up, and you begin to then be able to walk out that newness of life with Christ shining on you. But there's another sense that the Bible uses for sleep and awake, and that's the sense, it's in terms of awareness, not salvation. So if 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 5 says, for you all are children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or darkness. So you're all Christians. You're all awake in that sense. Then he goes on and says, so then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. He's saying there's this way of talking about being awake and asleep that's not about whether you're a Christian or not, but whether you're living aware of what it means that God is the central reality in all of your life. There's a way then, if I can put it this way, of living kind of drowsy. There's you can be a Christian and live a spiritually drowsy life where you're only a little bit aware of the reality of the Lord. So you don't say God's asleep, but you live like it. You don't think you're asleep, but you live like it. Half awake, half asleep. It's a spiritual drowsiness. And drowsiness, like being half asleep, physically, you know that sensation. It's a weird thing. Like you're present, but you're not. I have a newborn in my house right now, so I'm very well aware of how this works. Like it's fascinating. Like you're there, but you're not all the way there. You know, and if you want someone who's drowsy to help you move, they're kind of helpful, but not that helpful. You know, like their physical strength is not all the way there. And if you try and have a really deep emotional conversation with someone who's half asleep, and they're not really emotionally all there for you either, you're like, you're kind of there, but you're mainly not when you're really drowsy. And it's the same way spiritually. And that's what 1 Thessalonians is getting at in some ways, and many other parts of the Bible. You believe in God, but you don't think about him at all during the day. You know, like when you remember him later, you're like, I should have thought of him earlier. Didn't. Probably will happen again tomorrow. You know, like you find yourself regularly absent from the Bible and from prayer, and you're guilty, but you're not really going to do anything about it. You know, like the main factors that are at work in your relationships and your job and your personal life, they just don't involve God at all. Like you believe in him, but at the end of the day, things will change for better or for worse based on your actions and other people's actions and some luck, all things on a horizontal plane. God just doesn't intersect it all. You're drowsy. You're kind of half asleep. You don't really see how he's a factor in all these things. And so what we need then, if you play out the metaphor, is not spiritual drowsiness. We need to find a way to get to spiritual alertness. Now, a lot of sermons end with what I said a few moments ago. You know, look, the wake-up call is God's power and his love, and they're huge. Let's pray. Now, there's merit to that, and I won't go into all that here with you, but there's a lot of merit to that. There's merit to meditating together on the power and love of God in Jesus Christ, and letting that, sermons are more than just the sum of the sentences put together, you know? At the same time, there's also merit in sometimes saying, okay, but how? Like, what do we do then, more practically? And what you have here in this passage in some ways, and in the rest of the Bible, is a way to reach spiritual alertness. The wake-up call is, you got to see God's power, you got to see his love. And in a way, he's showing us here also how to see God's power and how to see God's love in such a way that we find ourselves spiritually alert. So how do you get alert? How do you find alertness? Physically, you find alertness. You get physical alertness from resting well and waking up well. Both of those things. First, you have to get rest if you want to be someone who's alert. You will never be physically alert if you never sleep. It's just not going to happen. But you also have to wake up well. In other words, you have to to get out of bed, you have to be engaged by something you genuinely value. Like you have to actually go towards something if you're not going to stay in bed. And so for some of us, it's more of a struggle than others. But what you have, I read it, it was a couple years ago, in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about how they were having, the court system, I think they were focused on New York, was really having trouble filling jury pools because jurors kept falling asleep in the middle of trials. And so they focused on this one case, and it was about like a really complicated financial crime that violated all these financial regulations. And they kept having to kick jurors off because in the middle of the trial, as they're detailing all the regulations, they would sleep. They'd fall asleep. Okay, well, now you can't fall asleep on the trial. You got to go. And this one judge, a federal judge in New York, we have plenty of lawyers in our church, and I love you and value what you do. This judge in New York said, from time immemorial, jurors have been falling asleep because from time immemorial, lawyers have been boring. I don't believe that about any of you here, but clearly that federal judge in New York, I can't believe you put that in print. He was a lawyer. That's how you become a judge. You were a lawyer. But it's very complicated, or it's very common in complicated cases to have jurors who are falling asleep. And it's not just, okay, this is crazy to me, because you're deciding whether someone is going to spend years of their life in jail, and it is still too boring for you to stay awake. Like, that's crazy. I don't like that about humans. Like, we shouldn't do that. We should, I hope if I was ever on trial, people wouldn't fall asleep. But I'm not planning on being on trial, by the way, in case that got, nevertheless. But it's not just because they didn't sleep well. Like, at the end of the day, the material is just so boring. Like, it's clinical, it's dry, it's unconnected from their life, it's like complicated with all these moving parts, none of which they care about. And so, of course, it's hard to follow. It feels removed. Of course, they're going to fall asleep. And you need to have, you don't just need to rest well. You got to wake up well. You got to have something that engages you to be awake. At night, you ever watched a show versus reading a book? If the book isn't really interesting, guess what's going to happen? But if it is really interesting, guess what happens too? You always wake up for the things that you value, that you're going to find something boring, it's going to put you to sleep, or you're going to find it beautiful, it's going to keep you awake. These are the two options, even if you're well rested. And so to wake up well physically, you have to rest well, you got to wake up well. And the same way spiritually, you got to rest well, you got to wake up well. First, you have to rest well. You will never be spiritually alert if you're not regularly setting your heart at rest in the gospel of Jesus Christ. When your heart gets antsy, it gets worried, it gets insecure, you regularly take it to rest in the gospel. So for example, if you are feeling lonely, when you are feeling lonely, and you feel misunderstood by pretty much everyone around you, even those important to you, and now look, and that's not a whiny thing, no one's above that. Like, that's going to happen. These sorts of things happen, right? You feel this way. You feel misunderstood. You feel alone. You feel isolated. There are a lot of things you can do about that. You can get into community. You can invest in deeper relationships. You can open up to safe people in the church community. You can do all sorts of things. But at the center, what you have to do is take your restless heart to Jesus and say, even if all these people fail me, even if no one understands me, you always will. Like, I can never be alone if I have you. Because you're the one who knows me all the way down and still died for me. You're the only one that knows me all the way and still died for me. How can I ever feel alone if I have you? You have to do that. You're not going to drift towards that. It's not just going to happen. You have to take your heart, your restless heart, when it's happening, and drag it over to the cross and the resurrection and say, Jesus, how? Now, it's not a light switch. It's not instant. It might take some time and some prayer and some Bible reading and some meditation and even some community. But if you try and do the other stuff, the relationships and all the other things, without doing that at the center, you're just going to end up, spiritually drowsy for most of your life, walking around in sort of a stupor, a spiritual stupor. So you got to put your heart at rest. You have to rest well if you want to be spiritually alert. And you have to do that in such a way, that should be like sleep for us as Christians. You sleep every night, right? You usually say you want more sleep, even though you might make decisions that give you less. Like, you say you want more sleep. You always sleep. This should be as habitual as that. Every day there's a way your heart's going to get antsy. Every day there's a way of saying, no, come on up, we got to go to sleep. We got to go get our rest in the gospel. That's first. But then you also have to wake up well. See, like the jurors in the trials, if connecting your daily life to God feels like a chore, feels like boring details, then you're going to end up drowsy because you're just going to fall asleep to it over and over again. What you need to see is how compelling the Lord is, how compelling Jesus is throughout your life. And in a way, that's what the Lord shows us how to do in this passage. Because don't you see what he's saying? Compare, contrast, like play it out. He's saying, you have to constantly be saying in any part of your life, God hasn't fallen asleep on this. I need to wake up to him in this. Where is he in this? How does he intersect with this? Where do his power and love fit in at the center of this? Like, this is like set a reminder on your phone for every hour, put an index card in your car. This is the kind of thing, because when you're in the middle of your day job, or you're in the middle of going to see a friend for coffee, whatever it is, these are the day-to-day lives where you have to start cutting the trails and saying, okay, compare, contrast. What am I going to do? How does God fit into this? God isn't asleep in this. How is he awake? How can I wake up to him in the midst of this? If you do that regularly, you're going to find yourself seeing beautiful things, seeing him as the central factor in every part of your life. And you're going to find yourself doing it in such a way that you actually feel like you know him and you interact with him and that he loves you and that he hasn't left and hasn't disengaged. But so long as we're asleep to him, so long as we never look for those connections, we never are active in the process, it's going to be very easy to be spiritually drowsy, to feel like he's far away from 95% of your life. And so this is the beauty of being fully awake. The reason why we want to get more sleep, to be physically alert, is because you're fully interacting with the world, right? At some level, you can't give your full attention to things, you can't give your full energy to things, you miss the details of the things around you if you're not fully awake. And the details are almost always where the beauty is in life. It's almost never in the task that needs to get done. It's almost always in the details around it. And in the same way spiritually, if you rest well spiritually in the gospel, and you wake up well by making these connections, by looking for the way God is awake and how you can wake up to him in your daily life, in the grind of every day, then it's going to open you up to actually see what's going on around you. You're going to see more colors. You're going to interact with more of the world because you're interacting with God himself. And you'll live a life that is constantly aware of, interacting with, close to the God who made you and loved you. And parting thought, probably the most beautiful thing about all this to me is that what God is basically saying is this. He's commanding you, be awake to me because you know I will never fall asleep on you. And in the servant Jesus, he shows us how true that is. That's our call. Be awake to him because you know he will never fall asleep on you. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you that you don't sleep on us, that even though we fall asleep on you again and again, you stay engaged and you stay caring. Help us by your Holy Spirit to have open eyes to these things, to undo years of habits of ignoring you in the midst of the things that are important to us, in the midst of the places we go every day, the things we do without thinking about them. You're in the midst of them. Open our eyes so we can see you and appreciate the beauty and know what it means that you have made us yours with no qualifications, no hopefullys, no reservations. We love you. We thank you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.